Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. This is fun. I've never been in this room until today, so I'm a little wigged out by the shape and stuff. I'm going to try and do this notes free. I assumed I could do it and still have them anchoring me. So if you see me kind of retreat over here, it's because I forgot what I wanted to say. In fact, I might just carry them with me. Today I'm going to talk about digitizing the material book. I have 96 slides, which I know is a lot. If you get sick, just remember to look at the moon. So two brief announcements before I start. The first is that I willfully acknowledge my digital humanities amateurism. Specifically, I don't know much computer programming, which will show itself when I talk about pictures rather than words right at the first. The second announcement is I want you to not hesitate at all to raise your hand and introduce questions or corrections as we go, specifically because I'm just going to be talking through some of these slides. So anything goes, even if you want to correct what I'm saying, and there are people here who are probably able to do that. So please feel free to do that. With that in mind, here we go. So a brief roadmap. First, I'm going to give you all a history of EEBO, and that's really important for some reasons I'll go over. Then we're going to talk about EEBO fails. EEBO is Early English Books Online, which I'll tell you a little bit about and why it's called that. Then we'll talk about the uses of this thing called TCP, which I will tell you what that means when we get there. Finally, I'll make some claims, or at least some argumentative observations, and then lastly, we'll do some case studies, mostly for fun. So here's the basic sense of what I want to talk about. Typically, we go in this direction when we talk about books and digitization. We talk about going from the individual object to the digital object. We talk about going from the stacked archive to the digital archive. And it's right and just that we do this, because this is the way things go. When we talk about digitization, that is what we are talking about. So it only makes sense. But for some very important reasons that I think I'll get to today, I actually want to talk about the other direction and what it looks like to move, to oscillate, as it were, dialectically between the material and the digital. Specifically, I want to talk about the way that that movement, that observing the way we move from digital to material and back again, can actually provoke interesting insights across a variety of levels of inquiry. So the first thing I need to do, though, is to give you a brief history of EEBO. As I said, EEBO is Early English Books Online. If you haven't used this tool, it's really fun to look at, even if you have very little interest in early English books. Here it is. This is the main page. KU subscribes to some of the most advanced versions of EEBO. There are different tiers. And to understand what I want to say about it, I want to tell the history. So let's do that. So we're going to go from STC to EEB to EEBO. The first of these means STC is short title catalog. A short title catalog is basically a catalog of short titles. In the early modern period, titles are very long, and so in the early 20th century, the golden age of bibliography, there were these people who created short title catalogs so that a book could be referenced with enough specific information that we know what book it is, but without repeating the long-ass title on the title page. There were three main short title catalogs. The first is called the STC, edited by these guys named Pollard and Redgrave, and it covers from 1475 all the way through 1640. And that basically, that end date is basically because they both died. Another guy named Donald Wing took up their efforts, and he covered the rest of the 17th century. The last short title catalog, which is kind of the tail end of the early modern period, is the ESTC, or 18th century STC. And that was actually distributed first on CD-ROM, which is kind of funny in itself. So we have these catalogs, and I actually own a copy of the STC. It's this big giant book. It's really fun to look at. I never use it because they have this thing called the electronic short title catalog, which is freely available online. And that is still the standing record of all early English books. Now I'm doing all this, I'm explaining all this for a reason, so you got to stick with me. So then there's EEB. In 1938, I have circa 1935 up here, but in 1938, a guy named Eugene Power in Ann Arbor, Michigan, formed this thing called UMI, or University Microfilms. You've probably still heard of it because they publish people's dissertations, and recently there's been a big kerfuffle about whether or not it's just that they do so. They began actually the origins of UMI are that they wanted to give doctoral students a place to publish their dissertations. It was specifically for them to do that in order to meet their graduation requirements. So it's interesting that we've come from there to where we are now with that issue. They basically microfilmed all or as much of the STC as they could. They went to various major libraries and they filmed as many of the books in the STC as they could onto microfilm. And the goal of this, it's interesting, was very quickly, the goal became that in World War II, when things seemed somewhat perilous and there was a risk of the loss of these books, they were trying to preserve a record of the books. In the post-World War II era, it became a way to give access to early English books to people at universities in the rapidly expanding university system, give various people access that didn't have rare books libraries. So if you were at, say, the University of Nebraska, which is funny because we're in Kansas, it's not that funny, you could have and order this full set of microfilms. And in fact, KU over in Anschutz, I believe, is where they're currently kept. I think they've been moved twice, according to my sources. We have this full set of microfilms, and I don't know that you can even, can you access them? Does anybody know? Can you still look at the microfilms if you want? Yeah. Do you have to, never mind. All right, so this is, you have to roll it. I've used it once because I have EEBO, which is a combination of two sets of microfilms. So they just combined them and they formed early English books online, which since its beginning in the 90s has looked exactly like this. They've changed this front page very, very little. They've got some new things right here, but for the most part, this is what it looks like. This is what it's always looked like. It's interesting that the internet has reinvented itself multiple times. EEBO has never, ever reinvented itself, at least in this regard. So this is what we have. And EEBO, for those of you who aren't familiar, EEBO is basically a kind of a fancy way of accessing all of these images. So you go to the basic search page. You can search for various things, and author, title, keyword, subject, even the bibliographical number if you're trying to look up a particular STC book. And it's relatively useful. This is definitely Web 1.0. So let's say you wanted to look up Shakespeare's first folio. So under author, I've put Shakespeare, and under title, Comedies and Histories, since Shakespeare's first folio was published under the title Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. Everything all right? Okay, see you later. Sorry. I didn't know if I'd messed up the microphone, which has happened before. Okay, so if I did that, I would receive search results like this. And if you're familiar with EEBO, you're free to check your email right now. You return these results. These are actually results 3 and 4 for that search. But this one on the bottom here is the first folio. You'll note that the first image is actually the marbled inside of the title of the cover of this particular copy. You'll also note that you have all kinds of kind of bibliographical information, which is rarely consistent across EEBO records. And you'll see where the copy is made from. In this case, it's one of the Folger Shakespeare Library copies. The reason I'm telling you this, one of the reasons I'm telling you this, is that we have this basically a stack of wobbly permutations of a catalog. Here's Shakespeare, by the way. This is an example of the kind of image you can see. You can't even tell he's wearing clothes. You can't even tell he has a body, actually, in this image. But you do know that he has a forehead. Because this is a digital scan of a microfilmed image, which was negatively polarized, which was originally selected from the Folger Shakespeare Library by someone in the 40s. Actually, they probably started with him, so probably in the 30s. And they picked kind of an ugly copy. This one's drawn on. It's got a more contemporary binding, as the previous image suggested. So this is an illustration of what you get with EEBO. And I'm going to talk about whether that's good enough in a minute. So imagine that this blue box, and I want to acknowledge Ian Gadd of Bothsbaugh University. I'm totally shoplifting this particular slide from him. Imagine that that blue box represents all written material printed in England from the middle of the 15th century to the end of the 17th century. This is not to scale, by the way. And imagine this circle, it represents all printed material from that period. Imagine that this circle represents all British printed material from that period. Imagine that this circle represents everything that's extant, that is to say everything that remains with us to the present day. Imagine this circle is everything in a major library that EEB selected for microfilming. And then imagine that this circle represents only the copies that were selected by EEB in the 40s for microfilming. And that little circle right there represents what you can find in EEBO. So you can see where I'm going with this, and that is that as a complete record, and this is what ProQuest, the owner of EEBO, claims, as a complete record of all books printed before 1700, EEBO is actually completely unreliable. It's not a complete record. It's specifically, and I love the term wobbly, because it's like we're stacking up these sort of digitizations and remediations on top of each other. And this matters for some reasons that I may or may not get to. No, I'll get there. This is, in some ways, EEBO, a product of natural, geographic, social class selection. And what you are viewing is something other than reality, which is to say something other than real books, which is something we all sort of know. So then the next phase of this, that's EEBO, and this is in the year 2000, this is what you would expect from EEBO. But as early as 1998, there began this thing called the TCP, which is Text Creation Partnership. And this is something that's very quickly coming to fruition just in the last couple of years. Text Creation Partnership basically is a text creation partnership, a partnership among universities. It's not owned by ProQuest, which is what owns EEBO. They have been systematically turning into text files all of the books on EEBO. So you can see here's the advanced search, and actually I'll go to the full size one. You'll see when you go to the advanced search in EEBO, here's full text keyword. And it looks like just another box, but it's actually the most powerful tool that EEBO has. There's another way of accessing it. The University of Michigan has another portal, and it's actually more sophisticated to access the same set of texts. And although it's not quite the same set of texts for some interesting reasons. But so some thoughts about the TCP before I move on here. First of all, it's hand-keyed data, which is extraordinarily expensive. It actually costs something like $50,000 to join the TCP for an institution. I don't know the exact number because it differs based on the size of your institution and the level of access, and they don't disclose how much individual libraries actually pay for it. So if somebody here knows how much we paid, I would love to know. Later. Maybe in a text message. The OCR software, or object character recognition, that's what you do when you scan an image and then you pull the text out of it into a file. That software is still developing precisely because of the early nature of these texts. It's hard for a computer to read black letter font. It's actually impossible right now for a computer to read black letter font. Very smart computer programmers have now spent 5 years working on this and they still can't quite get it. There are two phases to TCP. One is early English books online, and the other is phase 2. It's pretty awesome. Phase 1 is 25,000 texts, and that's what it's going to stay. Phase 2 is currently in process, so that's always being, there's a slow accretion process there. Right now they're at 19,000 texts. Now, one of the big red letter dates for people like me is January 1st, 2015, which is when all of the phase 1 files, the 25,000 files, go public. They're just going to make the files publicly available to anybody who wants them in plain text format, as far as I understand, which is a big deal because that means there's virtually no work that has to be done for someone to work on these files. Okay, this is what the interface looks like. I know I'm running past a lot of slides here, so I apologize. We're going to get to some fun, pretty pictures in a minute. This is what the interface looks like on the Michigan site. This is not the EEBO full text, which I showed you a second ago. This is the University of Michigan site. They have a lot of different full text databases. Actually, they have a huge number of them, and this is one of their coolest. You can do your standard searches, right? Basic, Boolean, proximity. You can also search again by STC. My favorite is the proximity search because it allows you to do certain things. So let's say you wanted to look up the early modern proverb, love me, love my dog, which is one of my favorite early modern proverbs. What you would do is go through to the full text search, to a proximity search, love near me, 40 characters, that refers to the number of characters. Near dog, also 40 characters away. And you get, in this case, I only searched phase 1, you get 44 matches in 22 different records. There's some slipperiness here because, as you can see in this result, it's actually returning the same result because the word love appeared twice. I'm getting real tired, I'm talking a lot. Okay, so this is the basics. These are the basics. That's basically the nutshell history of EEBO. Anything to add, anybody? Have I gotten it pretty much essentially right? David, do you have any additions?
Well, in your history of EEBO, and you did the short title catalogs, whatever, you omitted the revision of the STC.
I did.
Again in 1976 with Catherine Vance.
I did.
And that expanded the whole STC considerably.
By something like 3,000 items, right?
It's much more accurate.
It is. Yeah, and there's also a lot of correction that they did. So you're right, thanks. I should have added that be the fourth one there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Your graph was sort of a little out of proportion. While EEBO does have a slightly smaller percentage of titles that are in the STC. I mean, it's not minuscule compared to this big circle that you had around.
Right.
I mean,
that wasn't to scale.
I mean, it's not to scale. So.
I think your point was not titles, but copies, right?
Right. Right.
So it's minuscule considering the number of extant copies.
That's right. So the Shakespeare First Folio, for example, was one of several hundred that exist, and there are lots of such examples. So when we talk about, the number of copies represented, and actually there are 2 First Folios on EEBO, kind of inexplicably, like they just decided, let's just do that. And you find that up once in a while. The same STC number will have multiple copies just because the microfilm had multiple copies. So, okay. Any other thoughts about, David, did you have one more thing? Oh, okay. All right, so all of this matters, as you can imagine, because EEBO offers us a fascinating instance of what's involved in the process of digitization. In fact, the fact that it is an early modern books online is, I think, what makes these problems much more visible. So if you care about book digitization in general, these things still matter, but they always seem to be less visible. It's interesting that the questions that I just addressed with respect to EEBO are some of the very same questions that people at Google Books have to address in the way that they consider the relationship between the material texts, where they get them, and how they put them in a digital format. And we'll get to some more of those here in a second. Okay, so EEBO is extraordinary. It allows you to find things like an everlasting prognostication of the change of weather by Kinki Abenezra, a wandering Jew. That is my best find on EEBO in like a decade, I think. It's fantastic. The fact that, first of all, there are so few Jewish authors in the early modern period, and the fact that he is advertised as being a wandering Jew, and the fact that we have what I think is a kind of self-representation of him on the front, on the title page. This is just exciting to me. You guys seem less excited than I am. So is early modern English books early? Well, no. Here's something available on EEBO from 1888. Is early modern books online English? Well, no. Here's something that is on the left side an Algonquin text, and on the right side it's the English text. This is Cotton Mather's Epistle to the Indians. It's also, I think it was printed in England, even though it was first printed in America. Those of you who know better can tell me. Is it books? Well, sometimes, but sometimes you get things like this, which is just a manuscript that looks like a Post-it note, but I don't know for sure. One helpful concept in dealing with the things that EEBO does is the concept of remediation, which is kind of a hot word right now. It's simply the process of converting one medium into another. In their seminal book, Remediation, David Bolter and Richard Grusin describe how our culture wants both to multiply its media and to erase all traces of mediation. Ideally, it wants to erase its media in the very act of multiplying them. And I think this nicely describes the animus behind a tool like EEBO, which promises a kind of access to books, but that frustrates that access perpetually in ways that I'm going to run through here in a second. But to me, instead of that being a problem, I think the real wonder of EEBO is, as those of you who are familiar with it and have used it can attest, is that it does anything but erase traces of mediation. In fact, it enhances those traces and actually continually frustrates the desire for immediacy and returns us to the material in a really important way. So here are some fun examples. And I willfully acknowledge that I stole a bunch of these from my friends who also play on EEBO. I found a bunch, about half are mine, about half I stole, and I can't tell you which ones are which. Here's one on the bottom right. You'll see there's a ruler, which is what they filmed in the process of microfilm, and then on the left-facing page is, I think, a dedication of the book to someone. This is one of my favorites. It's a catechism title page. On the left side is what appears to be a manuscript that's bound with it. You can see the stitch binding right here and here. And then on the bottom and right-hand side, someone has made musical notations. I don't know what song this is, but it would be cool to find out. My guess is it has to do with the catechism. Here's one, I don't even know what this is. I think that this is the center of the binding, and that this must be, I don't know. I'm not even going to try. I don't know what that is. This is one a good one. This is an unfolded octavo leaf that's been bound with folio pages. So over here is the left side, and it's just been cut off. I think that's what it is. Again, I'm not particularly sure. Here's one, another British Museum ruler with what appears to be black letter, a spare bit of paper. This one looks like a normal book until you call it up in the library, and then you realize that it's in red, interlineated. I'll go back so you can see. It doesn't look like it's in red, but it is. Those are my fingers. That's another accident of remediation, by the way. You do see a lot of fingers in EEBO holding the book down. This is a good one. You don't really know why the things look gray like they do until you call up the book and you realize that it's because they're red and the microfilm just didn't pick it up. This is just a binding. They spread the book out. You would never be allowed to do that in a rare books library now, right? To just cram the binding down like that. This is one of my favorites. You don't even know what the rest of the title page says. But you know it was at Harvard. I don't know. I've asked around. I don't know what that is. We know that that's 16-point Baskerville because it tells us that. Apparently it's some kind of guide.
It's registration marks.
What is it?
Registration marks.
Is this like a piece of paper?
Like when they line things up to make sure they print correctly on the page.
So why would it be in here? They just stuck it in there, I guess. I don't know. Okay. Sometimes you get notes from beyond. This volume has a very tight binding, and while every effort has been made to reproduce the centers, force would result in damage. It's fair enough, right? It's a good one. We know there's a book under here. We just don't know what it says. Pages missing. It's nice to know that pages are missing, right? It's nice to be told. We know this is a text about Christians. We just don't know what it says. That's very helpful. That looks electronic, actually. Maybe it's just really well microfilmed. Handwritten, irregular pagination, and you see the two fingers on the bottom. Badly stained. Here's a big ruler. There's a little ruler. This is actually a book that's about this tall. It's really cool. This is the same book. This book is so badly stained it's unsuitable for filming the best result possible. This one's funny. If you call up STC 4304, this is the first image. And at first you sort of have to think, what am I looking at? In fact, so this is a ruler, and that's just the front of the book, the actual, which is actually against EEB scanning policies. You weren't supposed to do that, but this person did that. When you turn it, this is the next image. That's the inside of the front cover. Here's the flyleaf, and then you get the title page. When you go to the end, you get the last page, you get the back flyleaf, and you get that. And then the very last image is this. So you actually get an entire book from cover to cover. It's one of the few that I've found like that. This one appears to be a digital remediation. I don't know what went wrong. This is the only one of these I've ever seen. But it looks like something just went wrong with the digitization. You also get signs of corruption, and these are pretty common. The reason this looks as bad as it does is, as I mentioned, that when they were microfilming these, they would polarize them. So all of what looks black was actually just light shining through, and then it just looks black. So it doesn't, when you call up this exact copy, I don't have a picture of it, it doesn't look this bad. It just looks worse because of the microfilming process. Same with this one. This one actually is all paper. There aren't holes in this paper. It just looks like it because the paper is so thin. So in this case, the black seems to represent acts of reading, that someone has handled this book so much that it's become kind of pulpy. Any guesses? It's a title page, but it's not torn because these are really maybe it is torn. I don't know. Okay, that's all the fun pictures for now. So a few things about TCP, and this is where it gets kind of difficult because we can really jump off the corpus linguistics high dive, and I'm not going to do that, except maybe after I'm done we can do that. But let's say you were interested in the line from Richard II, "Heaven be the record of my speech," from Richard II. If you wanted to find out how other early modern writers coordinated heaven and speech, you could use TCP to do that, but there are problems. So you would go to your full text search. You would say search for heaven near speech within 40 characters, and you get a decent number, right? You get 156 matches and 142 records, which is not bad. The problem is you realize that most of those matches are post-1600, and the reason for that is the UV problem of early modern English orthography, that heaven, especially in 16th century texts, was spelled with a U, which is a problem because then you have to search for all of the spelling variants. But ProQuest has outthought you here. Actually, so then you go and spell heaven and you get 76 more, all 16th century. ProQuest, the other interface, has a variant spellings, and what they've done is they've indexed every possible spelling of a word in early modern English. So it has heaven with a V, heaven with a U, HEA''N, I think that's in there. It's got, I think there's a terminal E in some cases. So you have multiple versions of the same word. You're all familiar with how this works. And when you have the variant spellings thing checked, it will cross-reference all of those when you search for heaven. So doing it on EEBO, you do a full text keyword search. I'll have to explain this. Heaven near .5 speech. And all that means is near searching for the word heaven near the word speech within 5 words. And you can do as many as you want. It ceases to be meaningful after about 10. And that gives you 103 hits in 93 records. I'm not sure why, because I haven't looked at all the texts, but some of the things that result in this search don't come up in the other searches, and I'm not in the other interface, and I can't tell why, because they're spelled correctly, so there's some kind of slippage that I can't explain. Okay, so if you can solve the spelling problem that way, what about if you want to search for coordinations of the word if with the word then, which you might want to do, say, if you're writing a book on Shakespeare, as I am. I have a book chapter on the word if. So you go to your ProQuest search and you type in if FBY 5 then. FBY simply means followed by. Excuse me. So it means within 5 words, if the word then follows the word if, it's going to return those hits. You produce 157,000 hits. Anybody guess why? Because of this. That's the word so in an early modern text, right? The long S and the word and the F look very, very close, and all that's missing here is a little crossbar. So that in EEBO, is a variant spelling of if. So if you're searching for the word if, it's going to return all the ifs it can find, and it's also going to return all the ises it can find. So all this result is telling us is that that if and is are followed by then 157,314 times, which is not particularly useful. I'm not trying to be super sophisticated in these searches, but what I am trying to show is the wobbliness, the difficulty that specifically early modern texts present when we try to digitize them and then do things with those digitizations. Imagine if you could use OCR software on something like those really corrupt texts, it would be very close to impossible because of all the corruption in that. This is yet another example. Okay, so these are a lot of examples. My point here is not to hate on EEBO. My point is actually the opposite. I want to show my love for EEBO and what it allows us to do. Make sure I'm not going, okay, got a few more minutes here. So people who use EEBO frequently and know its history tend to fall into two groups. First group are the not good enoughers. For them, the wobbliness of EEBO inhibits its usefulness. The not good enoughers are well represented by Diane Kitchuk, who wrote an article about EEBO's unreliability. I know this is a long quote. I'm breaking rule number 1 of PowerPoint, but I'm going to do it anyway. EEBO, she writes, is a surrogate of a surrogate. However, substitution is not equivalence. Hold on, I lost my place. Neither the microfilm nor the digital facsimile is equivalent to the original printed book, despite the enthusiastic descriptions of the publisher and scholars to the contrary. She writes that remediation acts like a distorting lens or opaque veil through which the scholar sees the mediated English book. And I'm going to come back to that language in a minute. Scholars may attempt to penetrate this opacity of the new host medium through imagination or scholarly grit, but in the end, the facsimile is not and perhaps never can be the real thing. She goes on to argue that the process of remediation transforms content as it filters, which is an interesting choice of word, through a new medium. The media layers work as distancing and distorting agents. The scholar, several times removed from the English book when viewing an image in EEB, the microfilm, increases that distance in EEBO and again in EEBO-TCP. So you see, what did I call them? The not good enoughers, they tend to want access to the real book, and they claim that EEBO isn't really giving them that. And in that regard, they're actually right. EEBO's not giving them real books, so we can give them that. But there are problems with this. But before I do that, I need to tell you about the good enoughers. The good enoughers aren't so troubled by problems that the not good enoughers tend to criticize. They just don't care as much. They're not particularly offended by these things. They tend to cluster around people like Bolter and Grusin, who say the very act of remediation ensures that the older medium, in this case books, cannot be entirely effaced. The new medium remains dependent on the older one in acknowledged or unacknowledged ways. So good enoughers, they recognize the wobbliness of EEBO, but they still find its presentation of the book medium satisfactorily useful. And if I'm honest, I'm more of a good enougher, but again, I'll tell you why I think both of these are problematic here in a second. They do so, they trust in EEBO, or at least they find EEBO good enough, because EEBO willfully acknowledges its dependence on the older medium. The whole point of EEBO is that it's not just digitizing something, that it's digitizing something that exists in the world. That made no sense, but whatever, okay. But here's the interesting thing. Both the not good enoughers and the good enoughers, which I am admittedly yoking together in a gross, horrible way, they conceive of EEBO's remedial process as one of layering or filtering, right? The language that Kitchuk uses. I can't say her name correctly. So they think of this thing that's the book, and they think that after you have a book, you have a microfilm that's then subsequently digitized, that's then subsequently textualized in TCP. And the scholar can always be outside of this. The scholar's sort of like, I should have done like a little guy right here, because it's like we are supposed to peer through, and Diane Kitchuk uses that language of peering through these layers to access something real or original. You know, that's, I guess the real flaw, and I need to look at my notes here because this is kind of my one argument. The one real flaw in this way of thinking is that it insists that we must contend with remediation, as if these processes are always and already the enemy that we must sort of do battle with, as it were, in order to get to something real. When in fact, in actual practice, as the huge number of examples I just drew out suggest that in fact these different mediations are actually discrete nodes of transaction that when sort of triangulated appropriately enable new insights. So instead of trying to peer to something real, we can use the digital medium as a way of actually illuminating new things, particularly sort of cultural expressions. So a couple of brief case studies, very brief. Wing D897. Truth Defended, or A Triple Answer to the Late Triumvirates. This is one of the many polemical tracts that survives. If you look on EEBO, this is the last page. But if you call it up in at least 2 libraries, stitched to the back of this polemic tract is a little note from the same printer, but not the same print run, for conditions of sale. And it says things like, first, the highest bidder is the buyer. These are the rules of selling the book. And this exists in at least 2 of this particular tract, so we know that the printer was attaching it to these especially. The last one's my favorite. The money is to be paid on the delivery of the books, either as they are sold or the next morning after the sale. So if it's like layaway. If you don't have the money, you can take the book home and pay them the next day. And after that, you get a catalog of books, right? So you get these particular books, most of which, I looked up some of them, most of which are also polemical tracts. And there's the last page there with the remediation of my left hand. So I guess the reason this is an interesting case study for exactly what I'm talking about is that looking at the EEBO copy, which does not contain this, and looking at what was added subsequently by the printer, allows us to see this kind of uncanny recapitulation of the front page, which is available on EEBO. So you'll note that one of the things that this polemic tract does is it talks about other texts with which it's disagreeing. Whereas the texts at the back are all, if you look at them, they are all written by people who agree with this particular writer's religious disposition. So what's happened is this piece of addition, which is not available on EEBO, it's almost like a kind of uncanny recapitulation of the thing that the text itself advertises itself as being about. I'm not trying to be extensive here, I'm just being suggestive as possible. Another case study, actually I'm going to move past this one. Here's another one. This one's really fun for me. If you look up STC 23576 on EEBO, this is what you see. Lacrimae lacrimarum. This is a mourning text for Prince Henry, who died in 1612. But if you call up the book in the library, this is what you see. And in fact, you go through the book and you see that it's all in black because it's a mourning book, right? Do I have this on the forward? No, I don't. So what's happened here, I think, and I've asked a couple of people about this, and the best guess we have for how this worked out was that the person who was in charge of microfilming the copies saw this and thought that it was a mistake in the negative polarization. So they reverse polarized it and put it like that on the microfilm copy. I hope I'm not the only person who gets excited about this kind of stuff, because this is really fun. So what we have in this case, and again, I want to just be briefly suggestive, is the way that, in this case, the microfilm process illuminates interesting features. What those might be, I'm not sure. All right, last example, and my favorite one. STC 22366, a text called Venus and Adonis. Some of you may be familiar. It doesn't advertise its author. This is published in 1636. On the inside page, you see a letter to this guy named Henry Risley, and it's signed by this guy named William Shakespeare. But nowhere throughout the entire book is that is to say the actual book, is the author of the poem noted, except in this signature. Where the author's name is referenced is on this little card, which is a product of the microfilming process. And as you turn the pages of the images of EEBO, you see that this little card is on every single one. In fact, let me show you the thumbnail view. You can see it's on every single page in the book. Whoever microfilmed this specifically inserted that little card onto the image that they were filming. And there are some things we could do with that. The thing I want to do with that is talk about the way in which, by 1636, what this reveals to, what this sort of helps us to see, by this I mean this digital presentation, it helps us to see the extent to which that by 1636, Shakespeare was so closely associated with writing Venus and Adonis that his name did not need to be on the title page. And yet, here's this desire in the early 20th century to sort of enforce his authorship on a book in a particular way. That's the most sophisticated I'm going to get when I talk about this. Elspeth.
I'm just going to put a wild guess out there. That's probably the call slip. So that's why it says it's just they ticked it off to the side. So the call slip that would stay in the rear book.
Right.
And so as they're filming it, it's just
Yes.
off to the side.
Okay, yes. So
And the call slip would
say Shakespeare.
And the author.
Good. So it's definitely doesn't need to be intentional. It's probably not. But it's interesting that if you look at this is an octavo, other octavos will start with the call slip in place and then it will be removed. But it's interesting that here, this is the one case I can find where it's maintained through the entire set of images, for whatever that's worth. Okay. What's that, Karen?
Typically, it would be tucked at the last page of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, the book is sitting there and he's turning the page and it just stays there.
Right. But then the question is, why would, in other cases, would they, I don't want to push too hard on this, I'm just being suggestive. This is my way out of this. But in other cases, you have the exact same thing on the first couple of pages, on the first couple of images, and then it's sort of, it's cut off by the microfilmer says, okay, I don't need that anymore. I don't know what to make of it beyond this. Okay, so this is basically the end of my talk. The basic idea, as I've said, is simply that, that these things can interact as much as they can distract. And in fact, those places where the digital medium offers us the most resistance is the place that is often the most productive and interesting, as I hope these particular case studies have been illuminated. Okay, I've talked a long time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for listening. What are your thoughts?